Hey friend, I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we start, I just want to say thank you. This space we create together, it matters. So if you enjoy what you're about to hear, do me a favor, give the video a like, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It really helps more than you know. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Which city? Which country? And what time is it right now? Is it midnight? Is it 3 a.m.? Are you watching this while the world sleeps? I read every comment, and I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, close your eyes, if you'd like. Get comfortable, because tonight, we're going to talk about something no one wants to say out loud. Not in schools, not in documentaries, not even in quiet conversation. We're going to talk about what Homo sapiens really did. Not the polished myths, not the sanitized triumphs. The truth, the soft, dark, steady rhythm behind everything we built. The part that wasn't noble, the part that was necessary. Because to survive, to dominate, to last, Homo sapiens didn't just invent tools. We invented forgetting. We didn't just draw on cave walls. We erased what was there before. And that story begins not with civilization, not with fire, not even with language. It begins with something colder, sharper, a silence that follows footsteps in the dark. When Homo sapiens spread out from East Africa, we were not alone. There were others. Homo neanderthalensis, Homo denisova, Homo floresiensis, Homo erectus, different people, different minds, different ways of being. And one by one, they disappeared. Not instantly, not violently at least, not always, but inevitably. Because we didn't share, we didn't merge, we replaced. We consumed land, game, space. We bred them out, we outnumbered them, outthought them, survived where they couldn't. And maybe sometimes, we killed. Not out of cruelty, but out of competition, out of hunger, out of fear. The bones don't always say, but the patterns do. In every region where we arrived, they fade, and we remain, like a tide swallowing footprints. And we called it history. But it was something older. It was instinct. It was the quiet understanding that there could be no us without a them that vanished. And as we spread, we learned that survival wasn't just about food or fire. It was about control. So we turned nature into symbol. Trees became gods, rivers became boundaries, animals became spirits, and then tools, and then meat, and then trophies. The line blurred between reverence and domination, between awe and ownership. And in the middle of that blur, we changed. We stopped seeing ourselves as part of the world. We became its narrator, its judge, its curator, and sometimes its executioner. We shaped the land with fire. We turned forests into fields. We followed the herds, then trapped them, then penned them, then bred them. And we thought that meant we were smarter, that we had ascended. But all we had done was remove the parts of the world that didn't bend to us. We didn't coexist. We filtered, we selected, we simplified, we turned chaos into grids. But the cost was invisibility. The species that left no bones. The languages that left no script. The dreams that died before they were carved in stone. Homo sapiens didn't just build, they erased. They outlasted by forgetting. And the forgetting became culture. Stories that glorified conquest. Myths that justified hierarchy. Gods that blessed only the winners. And we passed those stories on. Not because they were true, but because they worked. They kept us together, focused, ready. And when new tribes met, the first question was never, what can we learn? It was, are they like us? And if the answer was no, then soon, they wouldn't be there at all. Sometimes through war, sometimes through disease, sometimes through marriage, but always through absorption, through erasure, through the slow, patient grinding down of difference, until only one name remained, one tongue, one God, one flag, one story, and we called it unity. But it was something older, something deeper, something quiet, something no one wanted to name, because to name it would mean we knew, and to know would mean we chose, and to choose would mean we're responsible. So instead, we told stories of destiny, of progress, of inevitability, as if the bones beneath our feet were not a choice, but a path, as if the silence behind us was not loss, but luck, and we kept walking, kept building, kept conquering, until we forgot what we'd forgotten, but it never forgot us. The forests remember, the languages remember, the soil remembers, and somewhere inside, so do we. That itch in the back of your mind, that ache when you see a map and wonder what was there before, that silence that fills museums more than the exhibits do. That's not nothing. That's memory. That's the weight we carry, not as guilt, but as presence, as proof that we were not the first, and we were not alone, and we did not arrive gently. And that matters. More than we admit, more than we can say, more than history ever wrote down. But tonight, we remember. Slowly, quietly, together. They didn't call it erasure. No one ever does. It never needed a name. It just happened. Quietly, softly, like fog swallowing a village. Homo sapiens were masters of it long before they knew how to write it down. They didn't need to destroy to dominate. Sometimes they just needed to name. A mountain that once had a spirit became ours. A stream that once sang in many tongues became a border. A child who spoke a language from her grandmother was taught to speak properly. And slowly, without screams or smoke, something vanished. Not by fire, but by forgetting. That was always our most powerful tool. Not the spear, not the wheel, not even the word, but the silence between words. The look that said, "That's not how we do it." The pause that erased. It started with songs. Each tribe had their own. Their rhythms matched the land, the weather, the hunt, the morning. But when new tribes met, someone always sang louder, not better, just more. And the other songs softer now would be sung less. And then only at night. And then only by elders. And then not at all. Until a generation grew up that had never heard it and thought that silence was normal. That was the rhythm of our rise. Not conquest. Not even culture. Substitution. A steady layering over, until the original was just echo. And even the echo faded. We called it unification, but it was something else. A smoothing, a sanding down of the edges. Languages died not in fire, but in kitchens, in marketplaces, in lullabies never sung. Beliefs faded not in war, but in temples left empty, or refilled with new names, new symbols, new gods. But the walls were the same. The hands that built them still remembered the old ones, but they didn't speak. Not because they forgot, but because they were tired, because they knew that resistance wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was just lonely, and Homo sapiens feared loneliness more than death. That's why we built tribes, villages, cities, empires. Not for protection, but for belonging, even if it meant erasing the things that made us different. That was the cost, and we paid it willingly every time we chose a word that didn't belong to our ancestors, every time we mocked an accent, every time we laughed at a name we thought we were evolving. But really, we were trading depth for sameness, identity for convenience, memory for survival. And when someone tried to hold on to the songs, the words, the ways we said they were backwards, primitive, stuck in time, because progress doesn't make space for pause. It devours it, quickly, cleanly, without apology. And it calls the bones artifacts, the tools curiosities, the prayers myths, and the people it forgets. That was our brilliance and our wound. We survived by shedding skin after skin, culture after culture, until the only thing left was momentum. And in that momentum, we lost the map, the stories, the languages, the ghosts, and sometimes the reason. You can see it in the names of cities. They sound like the people who no longer live there. You can see it in the statues, built for men whose faces no one remembers. You can see it in the food, dishes with ingredients no one farms anymore. You can see it in the holidays, Celebrations whose meanings were edited so many times, they're now just days off. This isn't judgment, it's pattern, it's memory. It's the quiet truth that no one wants to say. Homo sapiens didn't just win, we streamlined, we trimmed the world down to what fit, and called it modernity. But even now, the old things whisper. In words we don't quite understand. In ruins we photograph but never ask about. In dreams that feel older than our lifetimes. In rhythms that don't match the music we know. That's not coincidence. That's inheritance, not of gold or glory, but of ghosts. We don't need to be afraid of them. We just need to stop pretending they're not there. The forgotten gods, the vanished languages, the erased songs. They don't want vengeance, they just want acknowledgement. A moment, a breath, a whisper of, yes, you were here. And that, maybe, is the next step of our evolution. Not forward, but inward. Not conquering, but remembering. Not erasing, but listening. Because underneath all the names we've given ourselves, we're still human. Still Homo sapiens. Still the species that walked into every land and left silence behind. But maybe, just maybe, we can choose something else now. Not silence, not noise, but a pause. Long enough to hear what we've missed. Long enough to hear who we were before we forgot. Your body remembers, even when your mind doesn't. That's the first truth we never say. You were born with instincts older than language. Reactions shaped by 1,000 generations of not knowing if the shadow meant death. That flinch when someone raises a hand too quickly. That tension in your shoulders when you hear footsteps behind you at night. That need to sit with your back to the wall. That's not anxiety, that's ancestry. It's what Homo sapiens kept. While everything else faded, the body archived what the songs forgot. Because when the stories were buried, the muscle remembered. When the names were changed, the pulse stayed the same. We call it stress now, fight or flight. But it's not a disorder, it's a monument, a living one. To every choice we made, every silence we allowed, every gaze we avoided, every path we chose not to take. And it's not just fear, it's hunger, it's breath. It's how your heart knows when someone behind you is staring. How you can feel a room change before a word is spoken. How you know when to speak softer. How you recognize danger in a smile. How you mirror someone without realizing. Homo sapiens survived by sensing, by noticing, by adapting. And that adaptation didn't always mean tools, or fire, or thought. Sometimes, it just meant knowing when not to move, when to blend in, when to hold your breath. And those things, they live in you now, in the way you walk, the way you listen, the way you dream, especially the way you dream, because that's where the old memories hide. Not the ones from childhood, but the ones from before. The cave, the hunt, the firelight on stone walls, the sound of breath in the dark. You've heard it even if you don't remember. That soft crackle of danger, that silence that isn't empty, that moment in a dream when you know you're not alone. That's not fantasy, that's inheritance. Your DNA isn't just code, it's story. And that story includes things we'd rather forget. Hunger that drove us to take more than we needed. Fear that made us strike before we asked. Loss that we couldn't explain, so we turned it into legend. And guilt so deep we renamed it progress. But the body doesn't lie. It doesn't edit. It doesn't justify. It just reacts, honestly. Consistently, repetitively, like a drumbeat from the beginning of the world. You feel it when you look over a cliff, when you step into an unfamiliar room, when you meet a stranger's eyes and something inside goes still. We thought we left all that behind, but we didn't. We wear it. In our posture, in our scars, in our illnesses, in our rituals. The way we bury our dead, the way we whisper before storms, the way we gather around light. It's all old. Older than cities, older than belief. Homo sapiens didn't invent meaning. We inherited it. In flesh, in gesture, in gaze. And that inheritance speaks loudest when we're silent. That's why people pray in hospitals, why we cry at music with no words, why we pause before we say goodbye. Those aren't habits. They're echoes from a time when we didn't know what came next and feared it. And that fear, beneath all our science, our medicine, our rationality, it never left. It hides under certainty, under structure, under confidence. But in the quiet, it rises. And when it does, we remember. We remember the woods, the fire, the cold, the hunger, the sound of breath that wasn't ours. And in that moment, we understand. We are not new. We are not separate. We are not the end of the story. We are a chapter, a passage, a breath, one shape among many. And our bodies, they've always known. Even when we forgot, they didn't always look outward. Sometimes the danger was within. Sometimes the threat wasn't the wolf at the edge of the woods or the stranger with unfamiliar paint on his skin. Sometimes the threat had your eyes, your voice, your scent. Homo sapiens learned quickly. Fear could be used, not just to survive, but to organize, to create order, to draw lines inside the circle, to name someone less. Not because they were weak, but because they were different. And in a world where difference meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant risk, that was enough. The first exile wasn't a punishment. It was a warning, a message to the group. We choose sameness. We choose control. We choose security over truth. And the body that was sent away, whether for a broken rule or a broken look, became the first ghost of civilization. We don't remember their names, but we feel them in our laws, our shame, our social codes. They were the ones who laughed too loud, cried too soon, stood too still. They were the ones who didn't pretend, and Homo sapiens couldn't allow that. Not because we were cruel, but because we were afraid. We always were. And fear needs direction. So we turned it inward, toward the woman who didn't want children, toward the man who wouldn't fight, toward the elder who remembered too much. We made categories, roles, expectations, not because we believed in them, but because we needed them. They made the world smaller, simpler, easier to explain, easier to punish, and we became experts in subtle control. A glance, a silence, a shared smirk, a rule that was never spoken but always known. And when someone broke it, they weren't just corrected, they were erased, laughed away, mocked, pushed to the edge, and eventually gone. But their absence didn't solve anything. It just left space. Space we filled with more fear, more suspicion, more rules. And we called it stability, called it community, but it was control. Soft, persistent, absolute. Homo sapiens didn't build walls first. We built roles, masks, performances. And we wore them for so long that we forgot what was underneath. We forgot what we looked like without the fear, without the need to belong. Because that was the real hunger, not food, not fire, but acceptance. Belonging, the look that says, you are one of us. We would do anything for it. Anything. Even hurt ourselves. Even hurt each other. Especially each other. That's how power was born. Not as strength, but as approval. The one who decided who stayed and who left held the true weapon. Not the spear, but the voice. And that voice shaped generations, shaped how we sat, spoke, dressed, loved. It told us who to fear, who to hate, who to obey. And when someone questioned it, they weren't just doubted, they were dangerous. Because doubt spreads. And Homo sapiens were terrified of that, of things that couldn't be predicted. That's why we made rituals, punishments, labels, outsider, mad, unclean, different. The words changed, but the intent didn't. It was always about control, about safety, about pretending we understood what we didn't. And we still do it. In offices, in schools, online. We exile with silence. We punish with laughter. We shame with language. We enforce the rules we can't admit exist. And we call it normal. We call it human nature, but it's not nature, it's history. Repetition. Fear passed down like a family name. And somewhere beneath all of it is the original question, the one we never ask, the one we're most afraid to speak. Who would I be without their approval? And the answer is this: yourself. Not the mask, not the role, but the shape you were before they taught you to be smaller, before the rules, before the circle. That shape still exists. It's buried under layers of survival, but it's there. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to remember it. Not to destroy what we built, but to understand it. To see the lines we drew not as truths, but as choices. Choices made from fear, from need, from the ache to belong. And if we can see that, maybe we can choose again. Not fear, not exile, but recognition. The kind that looks someone in the eye and says, "I see you. Still here. Still human." They didn't know what it meant. Not at first. The bones arranged in circles, the ash laid in spirals, the symbols scratched into stone with no clear purpose. But they did it anyway, again and again, until the repetition itself became meaning. That was the beginning of ritual. Not belief, not worship, but pattern, predictability. A way to feel like the world made sense even when it didn't. Homo sapiens didn't create gods out of awe. They created them out of fear. Out of the need for rules in a universe that offered none. Out of the desperate wish that anyone was watching. And if someone was watching, maybe there were steps you could take, words you could say, movements you could repeat, to make things safer, cleaner, more certain. And so we invented the sacred, not because it was there, but because we needed it to be. And once we did, we couldn't stop. We built rituals for birth, for death, for hunting, for bleeding, for seasons, for silence, for shadows. We danced in the same ways, chanted the same sounds, marked our skin the same. Not because it was true, but because it made us one. Because doing the same thing made the fears smaller, more manageable. We didn't know what the stars meant, but if we named them, maybe they would leave us alone. We didn't understand sickness, but if we painted our faces, maybe it wouldn't come. We didn't know how to stop the rain, but if we sacrificed the goat, maybe it would. We weren't stupid, we were scared, and fear needs rhythm, it needs repetition. That's why rituals work. Not because they change the world, but because they change us. They make the chaos quieter, the pain more distant, the night a little less long. But they also demand obedience, precision, purity. And when someone got it wrong, misspoke the words, missed a step, brought bad luck, there was a cost, shame, blame, banishment, or worse. Because if the ritual failed, it wasn't the gods who were wrong, it was you. And Homo sapiens could not afford mistakes. Not in the dark, not with so little food, so little shelter, so little certainty. Ritual became law, sacred law. Unquestioned, unbreakable. And slowly it became identity. Who you were depended on what you did, and what you did depended on what was allowed, and what was allowed depended on what was remembered, and what was remembered depended on the ones who spoke. The elders, the keepers, the priests, the ones who had seen, or said they had. It didn't matter if the fire god was real. What mattered was who got to speak to him. What mattered was who said what it meant, who stood in the center, who held the knife, who poured the blood. That was the true power of ritual, not in its magic, but in its structure. Its ability to create roles and keep them forever. We call them traditions now, customs, heritage. But they're still rituals. The ring, the name, the vow, the song, the silence. And we still believe, not in the gods maybe, but in the rules, in the safety they promise, in the order they offer, even when they hurt us. Especially when they hurt us. Because pain makes it feel real, makes it feel sacred. Homo sapiens always confuse suffering with meaning. If it costs something, it must matter. If it scars, it must be true. That's why we still pass down rituals that no longer serve us. Still teach myths that limit us. Still punish those who step out of line. Not because we're cruel, but because we're afraid of what happens if we stop, if we let go. if we say, this doesn't work anymore. Because if the ritual isn't real, what else isn't? What else have we built on nothing? And yet, not all rituals harm. Some soothe, some heal, some remember. The song your grandmother sang, the way you light the candle, the place you sit when you need to think. These are rituals too. Quiet ones. Personal. Sacred not because someone told you so, but because they hold you together. Because they anchor you in a world that still makes no promises. And maybe that's what we need now. Not bigger gods, not louder laws, but smaller rituals, gentler ones, ones that don't demand blood, ones that ask only for presence, for breath, for truth. Because if Homo sapiens are going to survive again, not just exist, but live, we'll need new patterns. Not to please the sky, but to honor each other. Not to control, but to connect. Not to fear, but to feel. And maybe, just maybe, to finally understand that the real sacred thing was never the ritual. It was us. They didn't speak first. They listened. That was how Homo sapiens survived. Not by shouting, but by watching. By noticing the way the grass moved, the way the air shifted, the way an animal paused too long. Sound came later. It was silence that saved them. It taught them to wait, to hold their breath, to still their bodies until the danger passed. Words were useful, but silence was sacred. It meant awareness. It meant life. In the dark, when the fire was low and the wind whispered of something coming, they didn't tell stories. They didn't argue. They waited. Still, cold, alert. Because every sound was a risk. Every voice could be heard. But the body, when quiet, could vanish, could melt into the stone, into the tree, into the earth. That's why Homo sapiens learned to speak with eyes, with shoulders, with fingers, with breath, a glance to the left, a tap on the arm, a slight inhale. These weren't accidents. They were messages, faster than language, older than speech. And still, to this day, we know them. We know when someone's smile doesn't match their eyes, when someone stands too close, when the silence is too heavy. We know when we're being watched, even before we turn. That isn't magic, it's memory. Memory passed through generations of silence, through thousands of nights when sound could mean death. And so we became quiet, observant, patient. We noticed patterns. The way a face tensed before a lie. The way a hand trembled before violence. We studied each other because it was safer than trusting words. Words could lie, bodies couldn't. And so, we read them. All the time. Still do. The tilt of a head, the slump of a back, the speed of a blink. We don't think about it. But it's there, every day, and it's exhausting. Because it's not conscious. It's instinct. And instinct never sleeps. That's why crowded rooms drain us, why silence sometimes feels louder than noise, why we remember how someone made us feel more than what they said. Because we're not just listening with ears, we're listening with skin, with gut, with spine. Homo sapiens learned to survive not by talking, but by sensing. And when we did speak, it mattered. Every word was earned, was weighed, was chosen. And even then, the silence between the words said more. That's why stories were sung, why names were whispered, why grief had its own sounds. Because language wasn't casual, it was sacred. It had to be, in a world where every syllable could give you away, could bring danger, could shift the balance. That's why elders spoke slowly, carefully, and when they paused, everyone listened. Not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. That space was part of the message, still is. But we've forgotten that. We rush, we speak to fill the quiet. We interrupt, we explain, we post. But something deep in us remembers how to wait, how to sense, how to sit beside someone in silence and understand everything. No words, just presence. That's the original language, the first connection. The one that said, I see you, you're not alone. And in that recognition, there was safety. Homo sapiens needed that. Not just protection from the outside, but from the inside. From loneliness, from uncertainty, from the ache of being invisible. And so we touched, we held, We sat close. We shared warmth, not because we were cold, but because it reminded us we existed. That someone noticed, that someone cared, and that still matters, more than anything. In a world where words are everywhere, but understanding is rare, maybe silence is the gift we forgot, the ritual we abandoned, the instinct we drowned in noise, but it's still there. Beneath the chaos, beneath the algorithms, beneath the roles and performances and masks, that ancient part of you that listens, that feels, that waits. You don't have to do anything. Just stop and listen, not to the words, but to what's underneath. That's where the truth is. That's where we are. Still, quiet, watching. They didn't smell clean. They weren't supposed to. Homo sapiens weren't born into a world of lavender soap and white linen. They were born into dirt, into blood, into rot. Their first breath was filled with the scent of old sweat, wet fur, burning wood, and things dying somewhere nearby. Their bodies were never separate from the earth. They were extensions of it, covered in it, crawling with it. And the body, to them, was not a temple. It was a battlefield. Skin blistered from sun and cold, feet cracked from miles of sharp stone, fingernails broken, blackened, hair tangled, full of ash, of lice. There was no privacy, no bathroom door, no antiseptic scent to hide the truth of being alive. They squatted in the open, bled in the open, gave birth in the open, vomited in the open. They watched one another decay, and they didn't flinch. They had no choice. The body was always failing, always leaking, always reminding them, "You're temporary." They smelled of fear, of infection, of whatever they had last eaten if they'd eaten at all. And they didn't apologize. They couldn't, because that was survival. That was normal. And yet, even then, they tried. They scraped skin with stone to clean it. They chewed bitter roots to stop the rot in their mouths. They burned herbs to mask the stench of death. They covered wounds with moss, ash, mud, anything to slow the coming of flies. They hated the smell of sickness, not because it offended, but because it warned. Something was wrong. Something was spreading. Someone would die. And so they watched the body with suspicion, with reverence, with disgust. They feared blood, not in battle, but in places it shouldn't be, in stools, in urine, on a child's lips. Blood was prophecy, and pain wasn't hidden. Screaming was common, groaning, gasping. Children heard it, grew up knowing how fragile the body was, how little it took to break. There were no mirrors, no clean sheets, no rituals for hygiene beyond instinct. A scratched bite could mean fever. A splinter could end a life. Homo sapiens lived close to death, close enough to smell it. They knew what dying looked like, the color of skin when the lungs filled with fluid, the tilt of the head before breath left. They knew, and still they tried to decorate themselves. With ochre, with charcoal, with bone. They marked their skin, pierced it, painted it, not to be beautiful, but to be seen, to belong, to separate the living from the dying. They feared disease like a spirit, something invisible, powerful, contagious. They blamed the wind, the stars, the gods, each other, and the body became suspicious, especially when it changed. A swelling, a lump, a cough that wouldn't stop, blood where there shouldn't be. They exiled the sick, buried them fast, burned what they touched. And still, it spread. And still, they suffered. And still, they touched each other, held each other. Because no matter how broken the body was, it was all they had. It was their only tool, their only shelter, their only story. And so they whispered to it, prayed over it, hid it, feared it. And when it failed, they grieved. Not just the person, but the shape, the scent, the sound of footsteps that would not return. They remembered the weight of someone's hand, the way they breathed, the warmth they gave off when they slept. And they understood that the body was not just a cage. It was connection. It was memory. It was presence. And when it vanished, Something unspeakable vanished with it. That's why we still fear decay, still perfume the corpse, still paint the face before burial. We inherited the shame, the fear, the need to make the body look less real, less close to the truth. Because deep down, we remember. We remember how it was, how it smelled, how it hurt, and how we endured anyway. Homo sapiens didn't survive because their bodies were perfect. They survived because they adapted, because they endured filth, endured stench, endured pain, and found meaning in it. They told stories about the blood, sang songs about the pain, made gods of the disease, not to glorify it but to give it shape, to make it smaller, to make it something you could talk about. Fear only grows in silence, and Homo sapiens spoke it into something they could touch, and in doing so, they did what no other creature could. They made even the ugliest parts of life sacred. They didn't know the word for pain. They didn't need it. They felt it in the body, in the bones, in the spaces that words couldn't reach. When a child cried out in the dark, they didn't ask what was wrong. They went to them, held them, listened. Not with ears, but with skin. Pain was the first language. A limp, a flinch, a breath held too long. These were sentences, and they were understood. A groan was a prayer, a scream was a warning. A whimper was a truth too big for words, and they knew. They had felt it too. The split of skin, the stab of hunger, the dull ache of grief. They didn't analyze. They stayed. That was enough. Presence, warmth, a hand on the back, a shared breath. That was the beginning of comfort, and it mattered. Because pain isolated. It made the world smaller, darker, slower. And in that space, being noticed was everything. Homo sapiens didn't invent empathy. They remembered it. In the way a mother rocked her sick child. In the way a brother sat beside a wound, saying nothing. In the way a stranger stopped to carry someone too tired to keep walking. These were not strategies. They were instincts. And they saved lives. Not just physically, but emotionally. Because suffering without witness is a kind of death. And Homo sapiens chose to witness. Even when they couldn't help, even when it hurt to look, even when the outcome was certain, they didn't turn away. They stayed. They wailed with the grieving, fasted with the hungry, sat in silence with the dying. And in that, something changed. Something sacred was born. Not religion, not yet, but reverence for each other, for suffering, for survival. They sang to the sick, rubbed ash on wounds, painted faces for mourning. They made ritual from agony, not to erase it, but to mark it, to say, this happened, this mattered, you mattered, and that still echoes in us. We light candles. We wear black. We send flowers. We say we're sorry, even when we don't know what else to say. Because some part of us remembers that pain must be shared, or it swallows us. The ancients knew that. They didn't hide their pain. They showed it, screamed it, danced it, cut their hair, tore their clothes, beat their chests. They let it move through them, so it wouldn't stay trapped, so it wouldn't rot, so it wouldn't kill them from the inside. And when someone was in pain, they didn't offer solutions. They offered time, touch, space. They let the wound speak. And when the pain was too much, they howled together, into the forest, into the night, until the sound itself became a kind of healing, not an answer, but a release. And maybe that's what we've lost, in our noise, in our hurry, in our fear of feeling too much. We push pain away, we distract, we deny, we numb, but it doesn't go. It waits. It waits for silence, for stillness, for the moment when we are finally quiet enough to hear it, and then it speaks, in dreams, in tension, in tears we can't explain, and we wonder why. But Homo sapiens wouldn't wonder. They would know. That pain speaks when it is ignored, that the body remembers everything, that wounds don't heal in darkness, they heal in presence, in patience, in witness. They knew that grief is not a problem to solve. It is a truth to carry, together. And so they did. They carried each other, through sickness, through loss, through fear. And in doing so, they became more than survivors. They became human, not because they built tools, but because they held each other while bleeding, because they didn't let pain go unseen, because they looked at the wound and stayed. When the sun disappeared, they stopped moving. Their feet stilled, their chests quieted, and their eyes turned to the edge of what could no longer be seen. Because the dark was not just absence, it was presence. It pressed in, it breathed, it watched. Night wasn't rest, it was survival. And Homo sapiens feared it not because they were weak, but because they remembered. They remembered the ones who didn't come back, the ones who screamed too far from the fire, the ones who vanished into trees that didn't echo. In the dark, you couldn't see the eyes staring at you, but you knew they were there. You felt them, between the cracks and silence, in the rustle of dry leaves, in the sudden hush of the wind. Darkness was alive, and they told stories about it, not because they were foolish, but because stories gave shape to fear. They spoke of creatures with no skin, of shadows that ate breath, of whispers that crawled into your dreams and stayed. These weren't just myths. They were memories dressed in mystery. Warnings passed from mouth to mouth. Night wasn't safe. It never was. And so they made fire. Fire was more than heat. It was a barrier, a symbol, a promise. It said, "We are not prey." It said, "We are still here." But fire could only hold back so much, and they knew that. They slept in circles, backs touching, spears close. They took turns watching. They didn't close both eyes at once. They listened for the wrong kind of silence, because silence could mean something waiting. They feared sounds too, but not always the loud ones. It was the soft sounds that brought chills. Breathing that wasn't theirs. A step that didn't match the rhythm. A whisper with no speaker. And in the night, their minds opened. The things they buried by day came out. Dreams weren't escape. They were messages. Memories twisted. Truths unspoken. Fears dressed in new skins. They saw the dead. They saw teeth. They saw things that would happen, and sometimes they did. And they believed. Not because they lacked reason, but because reason had no place in the dark. The dark needed faith, needed ritual, needed meaning, so they built it. Out of stone, out of bone, out of rhythm. They sang to keep the things away, drummed until dawn, painted marks on trees, left gifts by cave mouths. Not out of superstition, out of memory, because someone once did the same and survived, and they passed it on, night after night, until it became sacred, until it became law, until it became the first religion. The first myths weren't told in daylight. They were whispered over coals, spoken with eyes wide, ears straining. They weren't entertainment. They were armor. They told you where not to go, when not to speak, what not to trust. And slowly, these stories grew teeth, became gods, became rules. But in the beginning, it was just fear, an understanding that we are small, that we are hunted, that there are things older than us in the trees. Homo sapiens didn't conquer the night. They learned to speak to it, learned to leave space for it, learned to fear it with reverence, because fear kept them alive. And even now, with doors locked and lights on, we remember. We wake from dreams we can't explain. We freeze at sounds in the hallway. We flinch at the dark space behind us, because the dark never left. It waits, patient, familiar, inside us, watching, listening, asking us to remember, and we do. We remember the first fires, the first songs, the first time someone looked into the night and whispered, "I know you're there, but I am not alone." They didn't build fences. They didn't carve signs into trees that said, "Keep out." But they knew where the line was. They knew the smell of home, the shape of the trail they'd walked 100 times, the bend of the river that always meant water. They knew where their voices carried, where their children played, where their dead were buried. And they knew when something crossed that line, not with words, with instincts, with the hairs on their necks, with the shift, tea in birdsong, with the way the wind changed. Territory wasn't marked in ink, it was marked in presence, in footsteps, in ash, in scent. They pissed on the edges, rubbed their skin on bark, let blood drip where it needed to. Not because they understood property, because they understood danger, because they knew that what wasn't claimed could be taken, and what was taken was rarely returned. Homo sapiens didn't need borders, they had memory. Memory of who walked here last. Memory of what they left behind. A broken twig, a warm stone, a trail that didn't belong. And they reacted, sometimes with silence, sometimes with song, sometimes with teeth. Because territory wasn't just land, it was safety, it was rhythm. It was everything predictable in a world that never was. They slept lighter near the edge, kept weapons close, built fire higher, and they taught their children not just where to walk, but where not to. They didn't need laws. They had stories of the ones who went too far, who didn't come back, whose names were only spoken in warning. And it worked, until it didn't, because not everyone respected boundaries. Some wanted more food, more space, more control. And so the first conflicts began, not wars, not yet, but moments, encounters, a stolen kill, a threatened spring, a missing child, and then blood. And once blood was spilled, something changed. Lines became sharper, circles smaller, eyes colder. And still, they stayed. Because the alternative was worse. The unknown, the open, the wild without anchor. Territory was more than land, it was identity. It was the shape of a group's breath, the echo of their song, the weight of their dead. And they learned to defend it. Not always with violence, sometimes with show, with noise, with unity, with bodies standing shoulder to shoulder saying, not here, not now. And it mattered. Because in a world where everything could be taken, standing mattered. Homo sapiens didn't invent war, but they discovered the spark of it. In hunger, in fear, in pride. And they carried that spark carefully, knowing it could destroy, but sometimes needing the fire. And when they fought as one. Not as individuals, but as a body. A creature made of many. And that creature had one purpose, to protect the line, to protect the stories, to protect the sleep. Because without territory, there was no rest. And without rest, there was no dreaming. And without dreams, they would not survive. So they watched the edges, listened for cracks, whispered warnings, and made the dark hesitate. Because this was their place, their sound, their scent, their silence. And that still lives in us. In the way we lock our doors, in the way we glance at strangers, in the way we feel something shift when someone steps too close. We call it discomfort, anxiety, but it's older than those words. It is memory of lines drawn in dust, of nights spent guarding, of the price of not paying attention. And we remember, in our skin, in our breath, in the way we hold our children tighter near crowds, because we are still drawing circles, still claiming space, still saying, here I am safe, here I belong. And sometimes still we fight, not because we want to, because something ancient in us believes we must. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't carry flags, but they knew who belonged. They knew the cadence of their laughter, the way they held tools, the rhythm of their footsteps. There were no names carved into stone, no bloodlines written in books. And still, they knew. That one, he's ours. That one, she smells like us. That one, she stayed when the storm came. That one, he sang when the baby died. That one, she bled for us. It wasn't about blood, it was about memory. Shared hunger, shared cold, shared grief, shared fire. And the fire mattered, because it was never just heat, it was story. The fire heard everything, and those who sat around it belonged. They began to mark that belonging, first with looks, then with sounds, then with gesture, then with pigment, then with pain. Not to exclude, but to hold, to bind, to whisper, you are part of this, part of us. You will be missed if gone, And that mattered, because absence was the first fear, not death, absence. To not be noticed, to not be mourned, to disappear and have no one remember. So they created memory, in skin, in song, in scars, in secrets. And each group became its own breath, its own smell, its own silence. And they recognized each other in that silence, and when someone new came near, they listened, not to what was said, but what wasn't. They watched the stillness, the hands, the eyes, the pauses, and they knew, this one is not of us. Maybe not enemy, but not us. And they decided what that meant. Sometimes it meant welcome. Sometimes it meant warning. Sometimes it meant blood. But always it meant choice. Because Homo sapiens began to choose, not just who they mated with, but who they trusted, who they followed, who they called kin. And it wasn't always a boo T-strength. Sometimes it was about laughter, about courage, about the one who stepped forward when others flinched. And over time, roles formed. The watcher, the healer, the first to rise, the last to sleep, the one who remembered every name of the dead. And with roles came hierarchy, not enforced, not at first, but felt, respected, feared. And that hierarchy whispered new words into the group's bones. Words like obligation, like loyalty, like betrayal. Because when there is belonging, there can be breaking. And they learned that too. That trust, once cracked, echoes. That silence can be louder than screams. That exile is a kind of death. And yet, they stayed. They returned. They forgave. Not always, but often. Because the group was survival. The group was warmth. The group was witness. And without witness, what are we? Homo sapiens didn't invent society. They became it. One breath at a time. One song. One burial. One meal passed from hand to hand. They didn't have laws, but they had looks. They didn't have punishments, but they had absence. They didn't have oaths, but they had eyes. And they watched each other. Closely. Kindly. Harshly. With fear. With love. And in that watching, something ancient stirred. A need to be good. Not to gods, not to rules, to each other. Because every gesture was remembered, every kindness, every cruelty. And they began to shape each other, slowly, deliberately. And sometimes not even knowing it. They became reflection. You are because I see you. I am because you call my name. And when they danced as one. When they grieved, they wailed as one. When they fought, they bled for more than self. And that is how I became we. Not with words, with breath, with ache, with skin against skin under stars that didn't care, but they cared for each other. And that made all the difference. They didn't write rules. They didn't have judges, but they had rituals. They had moments that mattered. Moments when something changed. When a child became not child. When a death became more than loss. When silence became a song. And those moments were not random. They were built, layered, sharpened by repetition. And they were not quiet. They were firelit, full of breath, of sweat, of blood. They danced not for joy, not only, but for memory, for marking, for saying something is different now. Someone is different. You are not who you were yesterday. And the group sees it, feels it, holds it. And in that seeing, something ancient was written not on stone, but on skin. They marked their bodies with ash, with bone, with pigment, with scar. And each mark meant something, not beauty, meaning. That line, that was the hunt. That dot, that was the child lost in winter. That slash, that was the one who bled and lived. And it mattered. Because in a world with no mirrors, the body was the only canvas, the only history. They didn't speak of courage, they wore it. They didn't write down pain, they carried it. And others saw, others remembered. And in that memory was safety, was witness, was love. but not soft love. Not the kind that whispers. The kind that holds you when you scream. That pulls you from the river. That gives you the last piece of meat when they're starving too. And that love was ritual too. A rhythm, a knowing, a code without language. They began to test each other, not with cruelty, with thresholds. Could you carry this weight? Could you keep walking when your feet bled? Could you stay awake when everyone else slept? Could you kill when it was your turn? Could you bury your own? And the answers weren't spoken. They were shown. And those who showed became something more. Not here, not better, but older, even if young. And the group gave them space, gave them story, gave them voice, because they'd passed through something, and the others felt it. And in that feeling, the first roles deepened. The watcher, the firekeeper, the one who caught breath in song, the one who knew the roots that healed. And when they passed, their absence was ritual too. A place left empty, a name not spoken, a song sung differently, a scar reopened, not to hurt, to remember. And remembering was everything, because memory was survival, not just of food and fire, but of meaning. What do we do when the child is born? When the storm comes, when someone does not return, and the answers became pattern, became right, became sacred, not in the way of gods, in the way of blood, of skin, of hands held too tightly, of breaths counted in the dark, and they taught without teaching. The young watched, copied, dared, failed, and still were pulled back into the circle. Unless they weren't, unless the line was crossed, unless the pain given wasn't for growth but for dominance. And then, even then, the group knew, something's wrong. This isn't what we do. This isn't who we are. And that was the first law. Felt, not spoken, broken, not written. And they carried it into the next night, the next fire, the next story. Because stories became ritual too, the ones told again and again around every flame. About the one who fell but rose, about the one who sacrificed, about the one who betrayed and was never seen again. And children leaned in closer, not for entertainment, for instruction, for shape, for identity. And the stories grew bones, became longer, stranger, fuller of shadow, fuller of stars, and in them the group saw itself. Not perfectly, not always kindly, but truly. And they stayed close, not out of fear, out of memory, out of ritual, out of rhythm. Because in the rhythm they were safe, and in the safety they became human. It didn't warn them, the sky. It didn't change slowly, it cracked, it split. One moment there was silence, and then light. Sound, rage, not human, not animal, something else. And they didn't run at first, they froze. Every part of them still, like prey. Because something in their bones knew this isn't about us. This isn't for us. But it will swallow us anyway. And they listened. Not for words. For patterns. For mercy. For permission to breathe again. And sometimes it passed. The storm. The quake. The flood. And they stayed alive, but not untouched. Never untouched, because the silence that followed was never the same. It held echo of fear, of wonder, of questions no mouth could shape. Why did it happen? What did we do? Who is angry? And those questions weren't weakness, they were maps, directions in the dark. Because Homo Sapiens didn't just endure, they noticed, they remembered, they whispered to the fire. Do you remember the night the river took the trees? The morning the red sky stayed too long? The time the wind screamed like a woman, and the birds flew backward, and the fire cracked back. And they knew they had to name this, whatever it was, because without a name it could not be warned, could not be begged, could not be bargained with. And so they gave names, not words yet, but shapes, gestures, sounds made only when speaking of it, and each one meant something different. This one is the Sky Mother. This one is the Hunger Breath. This one is the Old Stone Watcher. And it helped, a little, to believe there was will behind chaos, Because will could be changed, could be soothed, could be feared in a way that felt almost safe, and that fear became ritual. When the wind grew too loud, they sang. When the rain didn't come, they painted the bones of birds and left them in trees. When the moon disappeared, they lay face down and whispered names into the dirt. Not because they thought it would fix things, because it gave shape to waiting, to hoping, to pleading, and it bound them, one fear, many hearts, and the oldest among them, the ones who stared longest into fire, who knew the smell of every kind of ash. They became bridges between seen and unseen. They didn't call themselves shamans, they didn't know that word, but they walked slightly apart, slept with their face to the east, ate only the first root pulled, or never the first. Their eyes looked past, beyond, and when they spoke, the others listened. Not because they were right, because they remembered. And in a world of sudden storms and silent droughts, memory was power. The memory of how long the last rainless moon lasted. The memory of the day the river rose without sound. The memory of the color the sky turned before the sickness came. And those memories became stories, and stories became offerings, and offerings became rules. When you hear the thunder, do not speak. When you see the blackbird at dawn, do not leave the fire. When the wind dies suddenly, cover the mirrors. They had no mirrors, but the idea was already there. The reflection, the echo, the double. And they began to believe not just in forces, but in watchers, in listeners, in things that might be hungry or pleased or indifferent. And they feared the indifferent most of all, because indifference meant you could scream and still be torn apart. So they tried to matter, with gesture, with gift, with song. And sometimes it seemed to work. The rain came back, the fire didn't spread, the baby lived. And they looked to the one who had whispered to the wind. And they believed. And in that belief, something old took root. Not faith, not yet, but yearning. That if they could just understand, really understand, they might survive not just longer, but better, safer, kinder, wiser. And so they watched the sky, listened to the wind, read the cracks in dry earth like scripture, not with eyes alone, with memory, with fear, with awe. And when lightning split a tree and the tree didn't burn, they touched the wood and said, "This is different now." And it was. They didn't start with gods. They started with silence, with questions whispered into the dark, with shapes drawn in ash when no one was looking, with dreams that felt heavier than sleep. And then something changed. Slowly, quietly. A flicker, a chill, a rustle in the grass that didn't belong to any wind. And they looked at each other, not with fear, not only, but with recognition. You felt that too. You saw it too. You dreamed the same dream, and the silence grew. Not empty, full, pressed in around them like air before a storm. And they gave it shape, not with clay or wood, not yet, with breath, with belief, with need. Because the fear of the storm was one thing, but the fear of the unknown watcher behind the storm, that was different, that was deeper. And so they began to build bridges, little ones, made of song, of movement, of offerings placed on stones. This for you, whoever you are. Please see me. Please spare the child. Please bring the sun again. They didn't know if it worked, but sometimes things got better. And when they did, they remembered what they'd done. They remembered the chant, the dance, the feather left at the cave mouth. And they did it again. Not just because it might work, because it made them feel seen, heard, less alone. And in that repetition, patterns emerged, and from patterns, meaning, and from meaning, story. The kind of story that made the fire feel warmer, that made the bones of the dead seem not gone but watching. And someone always noticed more than the others. The quiet one, the strange one, the one who walked the edge of the circle and spoke to the smoke. They became something else. Not leader, not hunter, but listener, interpreter. The one who felt the wind shift and said, "Something is coming," and when something came, the others looked to them, not with worship, with need. And the listener began to change. They painted their skin differently, wore bones in their hair, slept on the cold ground to feel closer to the earth. And the group let them, gave them space, gave them questions. What does the red sky mean? Why did the baby not breathe? Where did the elk go? And the answers were not always clear, but they were given with weight, with ritual, with rhythm. And that rhythm mattered, because the unknown doesn't need logic. It needs structure, a way to hold it. And so they held it, in story, in dance, in sacrifice. The small bird released at the edge of the fire. The milk spilled on the stone, the breath held as the sun rose. Not out of science, out of hope, out of desperate love for something that might love back. And sometimes it felt like it did. The rains returned. The child woke. The predator turned away. And belief deepened, became thread, wove through the group like sinew. Strong, invisible, necessary. And then they built objects. Small at first, stones smoothed by thumb, bits of bone tied with hair, carved figures left in the crook of a tree. And each object held meaning. This one keeps sickness away. This one speaks to the river. This one remembers the old woman who whispered to the moon. And those objects traveled from hand to hand, from fire to fire. And the listeners, now shamans, now guides, now something more, taught others to use them. Not many, just enough. Enough to keep the knowledge alive, enough to pass it on. And with each passing, the web grew. Not of power, of presence. The sense that the world was not just dirt and blood and fire. It was also breath and shadow and echo. And every echo came from something. Every shape meant something. Every silence held a question. And they never stopped asking, never stopped watching. Because somewhere deep in the marrow of Homo Sapiens was the knowing that they were not alone, that the world was watching too. They didn't mean to lead. The ones who listened, who painted the wind, who laid bones in circles and whispered to the moon. But others began to follow, not with chains, with questions. What does the smoke mean? Why did the fire hiss when I spoke? Why did she die with her eyes open? And the listeners answered, at first gently, with humility. But over time the answers hardened, became script, became law, because chaos fears uncertainty. And people begged for clarity. So the listener gave it. Not always true, but always firm. And that firmness became weight. And that weight became shape. The circle of stones became the center. The fire became sacred. The figure who sat closest to it, sacrosanct. And others began to protect them, not with weapons, with obedience, with distance, with silence. And the listener noticed that words made people move. That fear could be shaped. That belief had gravity, and not all used it selfishly. Some bore it like a burden, spoke only when the signs were undeniable, ate last, slept alone. But others learned to bend the invisible, to carve it into rules, to say, the sky spoke to me, and it said, give me your food, your daughter, your blood. And people obeyed, because they didn't know how to measure a lie from a vision. And sometimes the liar was right. The drought ended. The baby survived. The wolves left. And so they obeyed again and again. And the listener became the speaker. The speaker became the keeper. The keeper became the gate between what is and what might be. And no one crossed without permission. And those who tried vanished, or worse, were cursed. Because once belief takes root, doubt becomes betrayal, and betrayal becomes contagion. So they kept close, tight circles, whispered chants, symbols carved in hidden places. And the speaker said, this is how we survive. This is how we keep them pleased. And the group listened, not out of trust, out of hunger, out of grief, out of memory. The time the chant worked, the time the fire stopped the sickness, the time the blood sacrifice brought the elk. And in those memories, power grew. Not loud, not fast, like moss, like rot, silent, relentless. And power needs form, so they gave it robes, paint, masks, a voice that echoed deeper than the cave. And when they spoke, no one interrupted. And when they pointed, others moved. And when they raised their hands, the silence held. And it worked, or seemed to. The rains came, the sun rose, the bones cracked clean, and belief cemented, became ritual, became inheritance. The child of the speaker was watched closely. The apprentice was chosen young, taught to hear the stone, to feel the breath of flame, to speak with the voice that is not theirs. And not all survived the learning. Some went mad. Some vanished into trees. Some wept and never stopped. But those who remained, those who bore the mask and did not tremble, became more than people. They became passage. And the people, desperate for meaning, for safety, for hope, gave them more than food. More than deference, they gave them their truth, their guilt, their shame, their fear. And the speaker held it all, and became heavy with it. Some broke under that weight. Others learned to carry it, to wear it like a second skin. And in time, they forgot what silence felt like, what it meant to not be watched. Because even alone, they were not alone. The spirits saw. The ancestors remembered. The sky listened. And so every action became performance. Every mistake, confession. Every dream, omen. And the speaker translated it all. Until one day, someone asked, "What does it mean that the birds flew north too soon?" And the speaker said, "It means war, or it means nothing, or it means give me your son." And no one questioned it. Because to question was to doubt, and to doubt was to invite ruin. So they obeyed, and built temples, and sang louder, and painted the walls with the blood of knowing. And somewhere beneath it all, the old ones who once listened to smoke and bone still whispered. It was never meant to be this, but their voices were quiet now, drowned by drums, by chants, by the endless need to feel protected. Even if it meant giving up the right to question. They didn't understand it at first. The stillness, the cold that didn't leave, the eyes that didn't blink, the breath that didn't come back. Something was wrong, not just broken, absent. The person they knew, the laugh, the smell, the rhythm of steps was gone. But the body was still there. That was the problem. It didn't match what they remembered. And yet, it was too familiar to ignore. So they sat near it, watched, waited, hoped. And when nothing changed, they began to ask, where did she go? Why did he stop? Will I stop too? And fear crept in, not just of death, of forgetting, of being forgotten. So they acted. At first, with instinct, they covered the body with branches, not to preserve it, to protect it, from animals, from weather, from shame. And then they added things, a necklace, piece of meat, a tool. Not because the dead could use it, because the living needed to give it, to ease the ache of helplessness, to say, I remember, I care, you mattered. And that gesture changed everything. It became habit, then pattern, then rite. A body wasn't just abandoned, it was seen, touched, sometimes washed, sometimes painted, and placed carefully, always carefully, face up, eyes closed, hands folded, as if they were only sleeping, as if they might return. And others came, not just family, the group, the circle. They stood together, silent, heavy with things they couldn't name, regret, fear, hope, and they made sounds, not words, but wails, songs, rhythms pounded on stone, and the sounds helped, not to stop the pain, to carry it, to make it real. And from there, meaning grew. If death mattered, then life mattered. If she had value in death, then she had value before. And if she could be missed, then so could they. And that thought rooted itself deep, gave birth to memory, to story, to the urge to leave something behind. A mark, a stone, a fire pit no one would touch. And the places of the dead became sacred, not because they were haunted, because they held proof that someone once was, and that was enough. But some wanted more. They began to dream of the dead, heard voices in the wind, felt a presence in the flicker of flame. and belief followed. Maybe they weren't gone. Maybe they watched. Maybe they waited. And if they waited, maybe they judged. And so offerings changed, became pleas, prayers, bread soaked in blood, hair wrapped in bark, words whispered into caves, remember me, guide me, forgive me. And those who claimed to hear the dead gained power, spoke of paths beyond the sky, of rivers made of stars, of places where the lost still wandered. And people listened, because it felt true, or because it helped. And so they dug deeper graves, built markers, arranged stones like constellations, burned herbs to mask the smell, sang names so they wouldn't fade, and the dead became part of the living, not just in story, in practice, in fear, in love. A child born was shown to the earth, to the air, to the bones of ancestors. A man hunted under the eye of his dead father. A woman sang to her sister beneath the moon. The world was full of those who had been, and their presence shaped every choice. And that was both comfort and weight, because memory demands care, and care requires time, and time is never free. So those who tended the dead gained respect, and later authority. They knew the right chants, the right stones, the right words to keep the boundary intact. And the boundary mattered, because if the dead could cross back, so could something else. And fear crept in again, not of death, of what lay beyond it. So they built rules. You must bury before the third sun. You must burn hair, not bone. You must not say the name of the angry ones. And from those rules came structure. And from structure, hierarchy. Some mourned loudest, some knew the old names. Some claimed to carry the soul. And the people listened, because grief makes us reach. And the ones who offer meaning will always be heard. They didn't always bury the dead out of love. Sometimes they buried them out of fear, because something lingered. In the stillness, in the silence after the breath had stopped, in the way the body cooled but didn't disappear. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. A wrongness, as if the person was still watching, waiting, or worse, angry. And so they started to whisper. Don't look at him too long. Don't say her name after sundown. Don't take anything from their body. And from whispers came rules. If a child died before speaking, you must wrap their mouth. If a man died in rage, you must bind his fists. If a woman died giving birth, you must leave something sweet on her grave. Not because it helped, because not doing it felt dangerous. Because sometimes things went wrong, the body would not rot. The fire would not catch. The birds would not sing near the bones. And fear grew. Maybe they weren't gone. Maybe they refused to leave. And stories spread, of footsteps near the fire long after nightfall, of shadows that didn't belong to anyone, of dreams that bled into waking. And the people remembered that once, long ago, someone said the dead could see, could follow, could punish. So they did what people always do when they're afraid. They built barriers, stones around the grave, ash circles, salt lines. They spoke chants, burned hair, placed tokens in the mouth, to weigh down the soul, to block the return. And still, sometimes it didn't work. A child would scream in the night. An elder would speak in tongues. A hunter would vanish in clear weather. And the tribe would look to the grave and ask, was it closed? Was it sealed? Was it done right? And if not, someone paid. Because the dead don't speak, but the living must explain. And explanation often demanded blame. So they pointed. The mother who cried too long. He-man who stole from the shroud. The woman who did not look away. And the punishment was swift. Banishment. Burning. Silence. Because nothing spreads like fear, and fear gave shape to memory. Not all who died were mourned. Some were feared. Some were forgotten on purpose, their names never spoken, their stones left unmarked, their stories ended. And still the people remembered them, in the way they avoided the northeast path, in the way they never touched a certain tree, In the way no fire was built on certain nights, these were not just superstitions. They were architecture, foundations of safety, of community. If we do this, we are safe. If we don't, we are cursed. And so the rules expanded. A body must face west. A bird must fly before burial. No one must laugh near the bones. And with rules came roles. Keepers, protectors, the ones who knew what to do. And they held that power carefully. Or didn't. Some guarded the rights. Others bent them, said, "She is restless because you failed. Give me your meat, your knife, your daughter." And they gave, because fear makes people generous, and belief makes them blind. And the dead stayed quiet, or didn't. Sometimes a body moved, a mouth opened, a hand shifted, and it was wind, or decay, or memory. But it didn't matter. It was seen, and what is seen must be explained. So they said. It was her spirit. It was his warning. It was their rage. And fear rooted deeper, became tradition, became worship, not of ancestors, of silence, of stillness, of things that should not be disturbed. And those who disturbed them were cursed, or believed to be. And belief was enough. A sick child meant someone broke the rule. A failed hunt meant a name was spoken. A storm meant the dead were displeased. And every event bent around the idea that the veil was thin. That something watched. That memory had teeth. And so they kept the rights, even when they forgot why. They poured the drink, burned the hair, sang the song, because forgetting felt dangerous, because doubt invited risk. And slowly, death stopped being an end. It became a doorway. And like any doorway, it needed guards, keys, warnings. And the tribe obeyed, not because they were sure, because they couldn't afford to be wrong. They wanted to believe it didn't end there, that when the eyes closed, they opened somewhere else. Not because they had proof, but because it was unbearable to think otherwise. The body stopped, yes. But what of the voice? The warmth? The dreams? Could they really vanish? Just vanish? No trace? No echo? So they said no. They imagined more. A place behind the firelight. A land beyond the mountain. A realm beneath the river. And they filled it with those who had left. Not as bones, but as shadows, smoke, wind, dreams. And they gave them form. He walks in the clouds now, she sings in the trees. They eat beside the moon. And stories grew, not to explain, to comfort, and fear softened. Because if there's a place after this, then maybe the end isn't real. Maybe we meet again. Maybe we are watched, judged, loved, even after. And so came the first if. If we bury them with care, they reach the after. If we burn the wrong thing, they get lost. If we remember their name, they walk in peace. Rules, paths, bridges to the other side. And slowly, not all dead went the same way. Some rose, some fell, some wandered, some waited. And they asked, why? Why is he restless? Why is she quiet? And someone said, it depends on how you lived, what you did, what you said, and how you were sent off. And death became a test. Life became a trial. And people began to weigh each other. He was cruel, he burns. She was kind, she soars. He lied, he's chained. She gave, she sings. And fear returned. Not of dying, of failing. And belief deepened. A child asked, where is mother? The elder said, she waits at the stars. A hunter cried, where is my brother? The shaman whispered, he took the wrong path. And the wrong path became a warning, a story, a ritual. They mapped the after, with mountains, rivers, gates, guardians, and the soul became a traveler, light as smoke, or heavy as stone. And some began to prepare, not just the body, but the soul, with chants, confessions, tokens, names, so it would not get lost. and grief changed, became hope, became plan. If we do this, we see them again. And this hope, this fragile, desperate hope, was stronger than fire, than stone, than blood. It crossed generations, and they believed that the good find peace, that the bad are punished, that the lost are guided, and the remembered never truly leave. And so they built, not just graves, but monuments, temples, shrines, faces carved in rock, names scratched in bone, songs passed in secret, and they whispered to the dead every night, every storm, every moment they felt alone. They said, "Are you there? Can you hear? Are you proud?" And silence answered. But the silence was shaped like a yes, and that was enough. Because belief is louder than silence, and it fed itself. A man claimed he saw beyond. A woman said she returned. A child spoke of dreams, and the tribe listened. Not because it made sense, because it made the night bearable, and bearable was enough. And so the afterlife became real, not because it was true, because it was needed. And needing makes things real, real enough to shape lives. And death became a doorway, not a wall, not a pit, not a scream, a door with rules and keys. And those who held the keys were powerful, the guides, the speakers, the ones who knew what the dead wanted. And the people followed, because they had to, because to not believe meant to fall, to disappear, forever. And no one wanted that, not even the cruel, not even the liars, because even they hoped, and hope makes people bend, bow, give, pray, and the world turned, and the dead stayed dead. But not gone, never gone. Not if someone remembered, not if someone believed, not if the fire was still lit. And somewhere in that warmth, they waited. They stopped being just many. They became one. Not one body, one breath, one memory, one voice that spoke through many mouths. And it began with silence. A shared pause when the sun disappeared. A common stillness at the sound in the night. And in that silence, something held them. Together. Fear, yes, but more than fear. A need. To know they were not alone. And so they listened. To each other. To the fire. To the bones. And they began to mirror, to echo. One moved, the other followed. One cried, the other watched. And the space between them grew thinner, not in distance, in meaning. And so they touched, sat close, grieved together. And in doing so, they made something new, a shape that didn't exist before. Tribe. And tribe had weight. It pulled, it held, it punished, and slowly it remembered. Longer than one life, further than one fire. The tribe carried memory like a wound, or a shield, and with memory came power. The elder remembered where the roots grew. The hunter remembered where the wolves circled. The mother remembered who had bled before, and remembering became worth. He who remembers leads. She who forgets follows, and so they gathered. Not just food, but stories, names, shapes in the dust, songs, and the world thickened with meaning. That is the place where she died. This is the stone that must not be moved. That path belongs to the red fox. That tree listens, and meaning spread across skin, across time. A mark meant you belonged. A scar meant you proved. A silence meant you disobeyed. And those who held meaning controlled it. And slowly, some rose. Not higher in muscle, in memory, in voice. In the ability to speak what others feared to say. The dreamers, the guides, the judges. The ones who said, "This is why you bleed. This is why the sun hides. This is what the dead want." And the tribe believed, because belief filled the cracks. Between fear and night, between pain and silence. And belief made people kneel. Not out of weakness, out of longing, for answers, for permission, for control. And the ones who gave answers became more than men. They became bridges. Between now and before. between life and what comes after. And bridges must be guarded, must be fed, and so the tribe gave fruit, blood, bone, loyalty, and those who did not were warned or vanished, and soon tribe became shape. Circle, rose, fire at center, and at the center someone who did not move, did not hunt, did not weep, but spoke, with weight, with certainty, and the people listened, because to listen was safer than to ask. And the circle held, through flood, through drought, through war, because order was stronger than chaos, even if that order bled, even if it burned, and those at the center grew stiller, grew stranger, wrapped in bone, painted in ash, smelling of smoke and roots, and their words echoed further than their breath. He said the sky is angry. She said the child must leave. He said the beast is cursed, and so it was, because power doesn't need truth, it needs belief. And belief was plentiful, and those who doubted were watched, silenced, named, and names became weapons. She is unclean, he is cursed, they are others, and others became firewood, stones, meat. And inside the circle, the tribe was warm. Outside, it was cold. And no one wanted the cold. So they stayed, even when it hurt, even when the voice lied, because pain with purpose is safer than chaos. And purpose spread. Roles, duties, signs. A child must speak before 3 moons. A man must bring blood before winter. A woman must carry silence. And those who obeyed belonged. And to belong was to live. And life was now something owned. Not just by the body, by the tribe, by the voice at the center. And they whispered, he decides. She sees. They know. And slowly people forgot they were once the same. That the center and the circle had once been equal. Now the center was sacred. And the sacred was distant. And distance meant power. And power meant fear. And fear meant obedience. And obedience meant survival. And they survived. And forgot why they bowed. Only that they must. They forgot who first spoke. They only remembered the voice. And the voice became rule. Not questioned. Not touched. Just followed. And those who held the voice learned that fear lasts longer than gratitude, that mystery feeds more than answers, that silence can be shaped into chains. They named what could not be seen spirits, curses, blessings, and each name carried weight because it could not be proven, only believed. And belief is easier than thought, safer than doubt. And so they taught. The child who asks too much is dangerous. The man who looks too far must be watched. The woman who dreams too loud must be cleansed. And cleansing meant silence. And silence meant peace. And peace was control. And control was dressed in ritual. The robe, the stone, the gesture. The word said only in shadow. And only the few could say it. And they said it slowly. So others would listen, would kneel, would give. And giving became duty, not to each other, to the order, the shape, the breath between words. And those who forgot their place were reminded, with fire, with hunger, with exile, and the people accepted, because safety lived in obedience, and obedience became sacred, and the sacred was the circle, the same one that once held them warm. Now it burned them when they strayed, and still they stayed, because outside the circle there was no name, no meaning, no after, only silence. And inside there was structure. And structure is comforting. It tells you what to be, when to bleed, when to birth, when to die. And death was now scheduled, measured, approved. And those who died wrongly became warning. And the warnings became legend. She crossed the border, now she howls at night. He touched the wrong stone now, he drags his shadow behind him. And legends kept the people in place. Not with truth, with fear. And fear is patient. It grows in silence, and silence was everywhere, especially where questions once lived. And so questions died. replaced by gestures, by chants, by silence that echoed like wisdom, and wisdom was owned, not earned, not shared, owned, by those who sat high, who wore the skin of beasts, who never wept, never knelt, who spoke in riddles, and riddles were holy, because they could not be undone, and those who tried were marked, not with fire, with absence. She is not one of us, he speaks too much. They remember the wrong way, and remembering became dangerous. Unless it was the approved memory, the clean one, the shaped one, the one that led back to the voice, always to the voice, and the voice said, "There is one truth, and it is ours." And truth was no longer a path, it was a wall. And walls are good, they keep out the wild, the dark, the different, and different became death. So everyone became the same, or pretended, and pretense became faith, and faith was rewarded with food, with fire, with the right to speak, and to be heard, and those who obeyed climbed, not high, but safely, inside the walls, inside the rules, and those who asked, what if fell, and no one caught them, because to catch is to question, and to question is to risk, and risk was treason. And treason had no face, only ashes, and so ashes piled. And the people danced around them, singing the songs they were taught, wearing the masks they were given, living lives shaped by silence. And silence was holy. They forgot, not all at once, not like a falling tree, like fog, slowly, gently, until the past was soft, until the hunger was just a lesson, the fear just a symbol, the bones just decoration. They forgot what fire cost, what teeth meant, what silence really was. And in forgetting, they smiled, because forgetting felt warm, safe, clean. And in that safety, they built stories. Not of what was, of what should have been, and should became truth. He was always brave. She never bled. They were chosen. And chosen meant different, better, holy. And holiness was contagious. It spread through words, through, walls, through skin. And people stopped asking. Not because they were silenced, because they no longer needed to ask. They had the story, and the story had them. It told them who they were, where they came from, where they were going. And they clung to it, fed it, passed it down like bread, like breath. And story became law, not the kind written in stone, the kind that lives in eyes, in gesture, in silence. It told you when to speak, when to kneel, when to look away. And they obeyed, gladly, because to disobey was to be alone, and alone was death, or worse, doubt. And so they shared, not the truth, the script, the approved memory. And memory became clean, polished, cut into shapes, taught in rhythm. She was born during the rain. He saw the stars speak. They walked through fire, and none of it was true, but all of it was needed, because without it, what are we? Just bones, just breath, just fear. And fear must be hidden, so they dressed it. In crowns, in robes, in flags. They called it honor, called it law, called it God, and they bowed to it, with pride, with tears, with blood. And blood became currency, the proof of belief, the seal of loyalty. And those who refused vanished, not always in smoke, sometimes in memory, erased, unnamed, unborn, because the story must be clean. And clean is never true, but clean is easier, safer, sharper. And sharp things protect, and protectors must be thanked, praised, worshipped. And so the story grew until it covered the sky, until no one remembered what it blocked, and the stars became props. The moon a symbol, the sun a decree, all meaning assigned, all doubt exiled. And in that light they danced, sang, built, killed, loved, all according to the script. And when a child asked, what if everyone smiled, and said don't, and the child learned, quickly, because questions leave you cold, and cold is death, and death must mean something. And so they gave it meaning, wrapped it in light, in music, in promise, and no one looked behind. Because behind was chaos, and chaos had no story. And without story, there is no us. So they told it again and again, until the sound became the self, until the lie became the truth, and the truth became sacred, and sacred means never touched, never questioned, never broken, and they forgot. Not just the beginning, the hunger, the fire, the teeth. They forgot the forgetting, and in that forgetting they became human.